Imagine sitting quietly in a small-town diner, the kind with worn leather booths and the smell of fresh coffee lingering in the air. Now picture an elderly couple, hand in hand, just trying to enjoy a peaceful meal, until laughter from a nearby table breaks the calm. But this wasn't the laughter of joy. It was mockery. A group of rich, well-dressed teenagers had decided that today, the couple would be their entertainment. What happened next would change everything, and just days later, when a limousine pulled up in front of that same diner for a quiet teenage boy who had spoken up, the entire town held its breath. What was meant to be a happy twist turned out to be far more heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. Hey there, friends. Welcome back to Stories of Hope. Today I've got a story for you that'll stay with you long after it ends. It's not just about kindness or cruelty. It's about standing up when no one else will, and what it costs a person to carry both pain and courage in their heart. Before we get into it, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? The diner was one of those places that hadn't changed in years. Locals came there out of habit, for comfort, not just for the food, but for the familiarity. It was Tuesday evening, and the booths were filling up with regulars. In one of the corner seats sat Mr. and Mrs. Dalton. She wore a pale blue coat and held her husband's hand as he helped her settle in. You could tell from their wrinkled hands and quiet glances that they'd spent a lifetime together. They weren't rich, but they were dignified, graceful in that quiet, old-fashioned way you don't see much anymore. At a larger booth just across from them sat 5 teenagers, dressed in designer jackets, flaunting expensive phones, and barely glancing at their menus. It was clear they weren't from around here, or at least didn't care to act like they were. They were loud, snapping selfies, tossing fries at each other, their laughter drawing annoyed looks from other patrons. But then, their attention turned toward the Daltons. "Look at the old guy trying to cut his steak," one of the boys snorted. "Bet he takes an hour just to chew." His friend added, "What's the point of living that long if you can't even eat without shaking?" Mrs. Dalton flinched, but said nothing. Mr. Dalton kept his eyes on his plate, jaw tightening. In the next booth over sat a boy, maybe 16. His clothes were plain, not ragged, just simple. He wore glasses that were slightly crooked and had a sketchbook tucked under his arm. He'd been watching quietly from the moment the teens arrived. You could tell he wasn't used to speaking up, not the type to seek attention. But something shifted in his expression when he saw the tears forming in Mrs. Dalton's eyes. One of the girls at the rich kids' table held up her phone, pretending to snap a picture. "Smile, Grandma," she mocked. That's when the quiet boy stood up. He didn't yell, he didn't curse. He just walked up to the table, voice steady, and said, "You should be ashamed of yourselves." The diner hushed. Forks paused mid-air. The teens blinked, caught off guard. "Why do you care?" one of them scoffed. "You their grandson or something?" "No," he replied. "I just have respect, something money can't buy." One of the boys got up, towering over him. "What, you think you're better than us?" The boy didn't back down. "Number. But I know the difference between being young and being cruel. One fades, the other sticks." For a second, no one moved. Then the owner, a middle-aged man with a belly under his apron and a temper to match, stepped in. "You kids have 2 choices," he said to the rich teens. "Apologize and leave, or just leave." They left. The Daltons tried to thank the boy, but he just nodded shyly and sat back down, opening his sketchbook like nothing had happened. The next day, word spread. The story made it to Facebook. Local groups shared it. Some folks came to the diner just to see the quiet kid who stood up for the elderly. His name was Caleb. No one knew much about him, only that he lived with his aunt and walked to school every day. By the 3rd day, something strange happened. A black limousine pulled up in front of the diner. People stopped mid-bite. The door opened and a tall man in a dark suit stepped out. He looked around and asked, "Is Caleb here?" The boy, sitting in the back corner, raised his hand hesitantly. "You've been invited," the man said. "Please come with me." Everyone watched in silence as Caleb stood, confused, and followed the man into the limo. The engine purred. The doors closed. The questions began. Who was that man? Where are they taking him? Did someone reward him? Is he getting adopted by a rich family? But no one had answers. That night, the diner felt different, quieter, uneasy, and in a small house on the edge of town, a phone rang. Caleb's aunt answered it, listened in silence, and then slowly sat down, her face pale. Because what was supposed to be a reward was something else entirely, and what came next would break this town's heart wide open. The sun was setting over the quiet town, casting long shadows across the narrow streets. Word had already begun to spread that Caleb had left in a limousine, not because he wanted to, but because someone came looking for him. No one knew who the man was, only that he looked serious, expensive, and didn't give any details. And now, with Caleb gone, people were left with questions and a growing sense of unease. Back at the diner, the regulars had returned to their meals, but the mood was somber. Even the jukebox in the corner, usually humming soft oldies, had gone silent. Mr. and Mrs. Dalton had quietly paid their bill and left shortly after Caleb had. They'd offered a small smile to the waitress on the way out, but anyone who saw them knew. Their hearts were heavy. Meanwhile, in the small house Caleb called home, his aunt, Ellen, sat on the edge of her sofa, the phone still in her hand. The voice on the other end had said just enough to send a chill down her spine. "There's something you need to know about Caleb," the man had said. "And it's time." But he hadn't explained. Ellen had taken Caleb in when he was 9. His parents had passed away in a car accident, and she was the only family left. He was a quiet, observant boy who never complained, never asked for much. He liked drawing, books, and walks in the woods. There was always something gentle about him, something that made you want to protect him. He never really fit in at school, not bullied exactly, but always separate, always the outsider looking in. Now, as the hours passed and night crept in, she couldn't stop pacing. She tried calling Caleb's phone, but there was no answer. She called the police, but they said, unless he was missing for 24 hours, there was nothing they could do. But something inside her told her this wasn't just a teenager sneaking off. This was something else. Caleb, sitting in the back of the limousine, stared out the window in silence. He hadn't asked where they were going. The man beside him hadn't offered. They'd driven past familiar streets, then onto the highway, then further still, into places Caleb didn't recognize. It wasn't until they turned down a long, gated driveway that the man finally spoke. "You'll get answers soon," he said. "Please be patient." The car pulled up to a grand estate, too big to be called a house, more like a mansion tucked behind acres of trees and silence. The doors opened and Caleb stepped out slowly. There was something hauntingly familiar about the place, but he couldn't place it. Inside, the mansion was quiet. No servants, no noise. Just the ticking of an old clock in the hall and the soft echo of footsteps on marble. A woman appeared at the top of the staircase. She was elegant, dressed in dark clothing, her face unreadable. She looked down at Caleb like she'd been waiting years to see him. "I knew you'd come," she said. Caleb stared up at her, confused. "Do I know you?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Not yet." The man guided him into a study, filled with books, paintings, and a fireplace that wasn't lit. Caleb sat, his hands fidgeting in his lap. The woman entered and sat across from him. "I'm your grandmother," she said. The words hit Caleb like a wave. He blinked. "My grandmother died years ago." "Your other grandmother," she corrected. "Your mother never told you about me." Caleb's mind reeled. "Why?" "Because she hated me," the woman said, without flinching. "And perhaps she was right to. I wasn't there for her. I wasn't there for you." He couldn't process it. The woman looked nothing like his mother, but there was something in her eyes, the shape of them, the way they focused, that made him pause. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a photograph, one of a younger woman holding a baby in her arms. Caleb. "I only found out where you were a few months ago," she continued. "I sent people to watch, to understand the kind of person you'd become. And when I heard what happened at the diner, I knew it was time." Caleb stared at the photo. "Why now?" "Because I'm dying." The words settled in the room like dust. "I don't want anything from you," she said. "I just wanted to meet you, to look into your eyes and see if there was anything of your mother left in them." Silence stretched between them. "You took a stand," she added quietly. "That boy in the diner, that's who your mother was before she gave up on this world, before life broke her. I failed her. I won't fail you." Tears welled in Caleb's eyes, but he didn't let them fall. "I don't know you." "I know," she said, "but I'd like to get to know you." He stood, his voice barely a whisper. "Can I go home now?" "Yes," she said softly, "but I hope you'll come back." As he walked out, the man in the suit nodded silently and opened the door to the limo. The ride back was longer somehow. He didn't say a word. When he finally arrived home, Ellen was waiting on the porch. She rushed to him, pulling him into a tight embrace. "Where were you?" "I called everyone. I met my grandmother," Caleb said. Ellen froze. "You mean your mother's mother?" He nodded. "She wants to see me again." Ellen looked off toward the night. "She's dangerous, Caleb." "She's dying," he said quietly, "and she said she's sorry." Ellen didn't answer. Inside the house, the lights flickered softly. Caleb went to his room, closed the door, and finally let the tears come. He didn't know what to feel. Anger, sadness, curiosity, and somewhere, deep down, a fear that whatever came next wouldn't be simple, not even close. The days that followed were oddly quiet. Caleb returned to school like nothing had happened. The hallways were still filled with the same voices, the same shoves in the locker lanes, the same teenagers trying to act older than they were. But something had shifted inside him. He walked a little slower, kept his gaze lower. The boy who once sat alone because he didn't mind, now seemed to do it out of habit. Or maybe fear. People stared, not just because of the limousine or the mysterious man in the suit, but because of what he did at the diner. Word had spread like wildfire. Not from Caleb, but from a waitress who had quietly told her friend, who told another, and so on. Some kids whispered he was being adopted by some rich family. Others said he'd secretly been part of a reality show, but none of them really knew, and Caleb didn't offer answers. At home, Ellen tried to go back to normal, cooking his favorite soup, folding his laundry just the way he liked. But when he looked at her, he saw worry behind her smile. He didn't bring up the mansion. He didn't talk about the woman who claimed to be his grandmother. But the questions hung between them in every quiet meal, every half-hearted attempt at conversation. Then, one rainy afternoon, a letter arrived. Not an email, not a text. A letter, sealed with wax, elegant handwriting scrawled across the front. To Caleb, from Evelyn Mercer, his grandmother. He stared at it for a long time before opening it. Ellen watched from across the kitchen but didn't say a word. Inside was a short note. "I understand if you don't want to see me again, but I meant what I said. There's more you need to know about your mother and about yourself. If you're willing, come for dinner this Saturday. No pressure, no expectations, just you and me. Evelyn. Caleb put the letter down slowly. Ellen finally broke the silence. You don't have to go. I know, he said. She hesitated. But you're thinking about it. He nodded. That Saturday, the limo came again. Not to the diner this time, but to their modest front yard. Neighbors peeked through curtains, some stepping out to get a better look. Ellen stood with her arms crossed, trying to hide her anxiety. As Caleb stepped toward the car, she grabbed his arm gently. If you feel uncomfortable, if anything doesn't feel right, you call me. I'll come, no matter where you are. You understand? I will, he promised. The drive felt shorter this time. Or maybe his thoughts just didn't allow him to feel the distance. When they pulled up to the mansion, the grand gates opened as if they'd been waiting for him. The same man in the suit opened the door and nodded silently. Inside, the dining room was a world apart from anything Caleb had ever known. Crystal chandeliers, fine china, a fire crackling in the ornate fireplace, but nothing felt warm. Evelyn stood at the end of the room in a long black dress, her silver hair pulled into a loose bun. She looked tired, her shoulders heavy with time. I'm glad you came, she said. They sat across from each other, a long table between them with more silverware than he knew what to do with. A quiet staff member brought soup, then roast chicken, then dessert. Caleb ate slowly, watching Evelyn more than the food. After dessert, she pushed her plate aside and looked him in the eye. Your mother didn't want this life. Caleb swallowed. What do you mean? She was supposed to inherit all this, the house, the money, the family name. But she didn't want it. She called it poison wrapped in gold. Caleb blinked. She never talked about you. I know, Evelyn whispered, and she had every right not to. She stood and walked to a small cabinet. From it, she pulled out a faded leather journal. She walked it over and set it in front of Caleb. Your mother's. She started writing it when she was 16. She stopped just after you were born. Caleb hesitated, then slowly opened the first page. The handwriting was unmistakably hers. Neat, thoughtful, full of emotion. He turned page after page. Words spilled out, of dreams, of rebellion, of pain, and eventually, of love and loss. There were entries about a boy she met, Caleb's father, about how Evelyn had tried to forbid it, how she'd threatened to disown her, and she did. She chose love over legacy, Evelyn said softly, and I punished her for it. Caleb kept reading. There were passages about living in a one-bedroom apartment, about working long hours, about the joy of holding him in her arms for the first time, and later, entries that stopped mid-sentence, scrawled, chaotic, like her heart had started breaking and the words could no longer carry the weight. I thought she'd come back, Evelyn said. I thought one day she'd call. She never did. And then, the accident. Caleb looked up, eyes glistening. Why didn't you come then? I tried, Evelyn whispered, but by then, Ellen had already taken you in. The courts wouldn't let me see you. And maybe I didn't try hard enough. I was ashamed. I didn't think I deserved to be in your life. Silence settled over the room. Then Evelyn added, but when I heard what you did at that diner, how you stood up for that couple, I knew you weren't just some boy. You're your mother's son. Caleb stared at the journal. You think that makes me special? No, she said. I think that makes you real. As the fire crackled behind them, Caleb felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something opened. A window, perhaps, in a house long closed. When the limo dropped him off that night, Ellen was waiting. She didn't ask questions, she just hugged him. And for the first time in a long while, Caleb didn't feel like he was caught between two worlds. He felt like he was finally beginning to understand them. The journal became Caleb's quiet obsession. Every night after school, he'd retreat to his room, shut the door, and open to where he left off. He read slowly, carefully, like the words were sacred, like they were all he had left of his mother. Some nights he'd cry without meaning to. Other nights he'd just sit in silence, staring at a single page. There were entries about her loneliness, about her joy when he said his first word, and later about her fears when she got sick. She never wrote the word cancer, but he could feel it between the lines. The fatigue, the desperation, the quiet goodbyes written before she even knew it was time. Caleb began to understand why Ellen had always seemed protective, almost overly cautious. She hadn't just been his foster mom, she'd been his shield, guarding him from a world full of unanswered questions. And now he was getting answers. But answers come with weight. At school, things didn't get any easier. If anything, they got worse. The rich kids, especially Liam and his crew, weren't done punishing him for what he'd done in the diner. One morning, Caleb found his locker vandalized, spray-painted words, "charity case." His backpack had been dumped in a trash can. Someone even snapped a picture of him getting into the limo again and posted it with the caption, "Rich grandma finally buying him friends." Caleb didn't fight back. He didn't speak, but his silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was something else, something firmer. His eyes held a quiet fire. Ms. Riley, his literature teacher, noticed. She pulled him aside after class. "You're different lately," she said. "More serious, more focused." "I'm just tired," he replied. She nodded, not pressing. But before he left, she said gently, "You know, some of the strongest characters in literature were the quiet ones, the ones who watched, listened, and chose their moments." That night, Caleb sat with the journal again. One page was torn, jagged along the edges, like it had been ripped in haste. It wasn't the first missing page. There were a few gaps, but this one felt important. The pages before it talked about someone coming to the apartment, someone trying to help her, a name. He flipped through the rest of the journal, looking for any other mention, and there it was, 3 pages later. "He said my mother sent him, but I don't know if I can trust her again. I'm not ready to forgive her, not after everything." Caleb's hands trembled. She was writing about Evelyn. The next day, Caleb returned to the mansion. This time, he didn't wait for the limo. He took a bus and walked the last few blocks. The guards looked surprised, but let him in. Evelyn was in the garden, seated on a stone bench beneath an old oak tree. She looked tired, even fragile. But when she saw him, she smiled. "I didn't expect you today." "I needed to ask something." She motioned for him to sit. Caleb took out the journal from his backpack and showed her the torn page. "She mentioned you came to see her after she got sick, but she didn't write what happened." Evelyn stared at the torn edge for a long time. "I begged her to come back," she said softly. "I told her I would take care of her, and of you, but she refused." "Why?" "Because she was afraid," Evelyn said. "Afraid that coming back would cost her more than she could bear. She thought I'd try to control her again, that I'd use money to manipulate her. And maybe she was right to think that. I'd done it before." Tears welled in her eyes. "But I just wanted to help. I didn't want to lose her." Caleb swallowed. "She wrote that she wanted to forgive you, but she wasn't ready." Evelyn nodded slowly. "She never got the chance." Silence settled between them. The breeze rustled the leaves overhead. Then Evelyn said something that caught him off guard. "There's something else I need to tell you." Caleb turned toward her. "I'm not well, Caleb. I've been sick for a while. I didn't reach out to you just to clear my conscience. I reached out because I didn't want to leave this world without knowing if you'd ever forgive me." He froze. "Are you dying?" She nodded. "I've been given 6 months. maybe less. The words hit like a punch to the gut. He thought of how he had barely known her, barely scratched the surface, and now time was already running out. "You didn't deserve what happened," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. "None of this is fair to you. But if you'll let me, I'd like to give you what I should have given your mother." A future Caleb looked at her. This woman who had once turned her back on her daughter was now sitting in front of him, frail and filled with regret. And for the first time, he didn't see a villain. He saw a woman who had lived long enough to understand her mistakes, and who now had only a little time left to try to make it right. That evening, when Caleb returned home, he told Ellen everything. She listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. When he finished, he asked, "What would you do?" She didn't answer right away. Then she reached out and took his hand. "I'd forgive her," she said. "Not for her sake, but for yours." Caleb sat in silence long after she went to bed. Forgiveness isn't easy, it's not quick, and it doesn't erase the past. But it's a start, and sometimes that's all we get. The weeks that followed changed everything. Caleb started visiting Evelyn regularly, sometimes after school, sometimes on weekends. Their conversations were cautious at first, like strangers trying to piece together a shared past neither of them fully understood. But little by little, something started to shift. The walls between them softened. Evelyn would tell stories about his mother when she was a little girl, about how she used to sneak cookies out of the kitchen and hide them under her bed, about how she loved to sing even though she was terrible at it, about how stubborn she could be when she believed she was right. Caleb listened, and each story stitched together a picture of the mother he had never really known. One afternoon, Evelyn handed him a small wooden box. Inside were old photographs, black and white snapshots of his mother as a child, a teenager, a young woman. In one, she held a baby, him, wrapped in a faded blue blanket. Caleb traced the edges of the photo with his thumb. "Why didn't she ever show me these?" "She didn't want to burden you with what she had lost," Evelyn said quietly. "She wanted you to move forward, not backward." There was pain in her voice, but also understanding. Back at school, the bullying hadn't stopped, but it had changed. Liam and his group had grown more bitter since the limo incident, but they now seemed confused. Caleb wasn't reacting the way they wanted. He didn't fight back, he didn't flinch, and that made them uncomfortable. One afternoon in the cafeteria, Liam made another attempt to humiliate him. He walked over with his phone, ready to record, and sneered, "Hey, limo boy, when's your sugar granny picking you up again?" A few laughs scattered across the tables. Caleb didn't even look up from his tray. But then, something unexpected happened. A girl named Sadie, quiet, bookish, always sitting alone, stood up from her seat 2 tables away. She walked over, her voice steady. "Maybe if you had someone who actually cared about you, you'd stop acting like a jerk." The cafeteria went dead silent. Liam's smirk faded. For a moment, he looked like a boy who'd been caught doing something he couldn't justify. Then, red-faced, he turned and stormed off, leaving behind a stunned crowd. Caleb looked at Sadie, unsure of what to say. She shrugged. "I got tired of watching you do all the work." After that, something shifted again. Only this time, it was around Caleb. A few kids who had stayed silent began offering quiet hellos. Some teachers began asking him to stay after class for help. He even found a note in his locker one day, unsigned, "You were right in the diner." I was too scared to say anything. "I'm sorry." But the real changes were happening outside of school. Evelyn's health was declining, slowly at first, then more noticeably. Her movements grew sluggish. She began forgetting things, names, places, even moments they had just talked about. Doctors came and went. Home nurses rotated shifts. Caleb began spending more time at the mansion, often staying overnight on weekends. Ellen understood. She had even visited once, sitting with Evelyn for an hour. There were no raised voices, no accusations, just two women who had once shared the same child and were now bound by their love for him. One evening, Evelyn asked Caleb to come sit with her in the library. Her voice was weaker than usual, her breath short. "I've written something," she said, handing him a thick envelope. "It's a trust. Everything I own, it's yours." Caleb stared at her. "Why would you do that?" "Because I failed your mother," she said, "but I won't fail you, and because I believe you'll use it the right way." He didn't know what to say. The weight of what she had just handed him wasn't just financial, it was emotional. It was history, regret, and hope, all rolled into one. "There's one more thing," she added. "I want to be buried next to your mother." Caleb's voice cracked. "She never forgave you." "I know," Evelyn whispered, "but maybe you can." A few days later, she fell into a coma. Caleb visited her every day, sitting at her bedside and reading aloud from the journal. He finished it twice. On the third round, he added his own pages, writing his thoughts, his memories, his hopes, telling her what he wished he could have told her sooner. And then, one morning, she was gone. The funeral was simple, no extravagant displays, just a small group: Caleb, Ellen, a few of Evelyn's longtime staff members, and to Caleb's surprise, Sadie. The casket was placed beside his mother's. Two women, one who gave life and fought for it, and one who tried, too late, to mend what she had broken. After the burial, Caleb stood alone at the gravesite. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the last torn page from the journal. He had found it weeks earlier, tucked behind an old picture frame in the attic. It read, "Maybe one day he'll understand why I kept him away. I only wanted to protect him, but if she ever comes back, if she ever tries again, I hope he listens, because everyone deserves a second chance." Caleb placed the page on the grave, letting the wind take it where it would. Then he turned and walked away, older than his years, but lighter than before. The weeks following Evelyn's funeral were quieter. The mansion, once filled with the hustle and bustle of staff and visitors, now stood in a somber silence. Caleb spent his days at school, at home, and occasionally at the diner, but there was a weight in his chest, a knowing that he had crossed a line in his life that couldn't be undone. But there was also something else, something lighter, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. The knowledge that he had come through the storm. He wasn't the same boy who had walked into that diner months ago, and he was no longer the boy who sat silently while others mocked him. He had found his voice, and more than that, he had learned to choose the moments in which he would speak. One cold afternoon, weeks after Evelyn's passing, Caleb returned to the diner. It wasn't for the food, though the comfort of it was something familiar. It wasn't even to relive the scene with the rich teens, which had shifted his life in ways he hadn't fully understood. He was there to sit alone, finally, on his own terms. As he entered, the familiar jingle of the doorbell rang, and he could feel the eyes of the patrons settle on him. There was no laughter, no mocking, just the quiet hum of life going on. The waitress, Linda, recognized him and smiled. "You here for a quiet cup of coffee, Caleb?" He nodded, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Yeah, I think I am." As Linda poured his coffee, she asked quietly, "How are you holding up?" He sighed, leaning back in his seat. "You know, better. I think better is the right word." She studied him for a moment before replying, "You've grown up a lot in the past couple of months." He let the silence stretch between them before speaking again, his voice steady. "I don't think it was growing up. It was more like learning how to live with everything." Linda smiled softly, a knowing look in her eyes. "I think you're learning how to forgive too." Caleb didn't respond right away. He let the words settle in his mind like the warm coffee in his cup. Over the following months, Caleb began to carve out a new path. He didn't let go of the past, but he learned how to live with it, how to let it shape him without defining him. The mansion was sold, and with it, everything Evelyn had left behind. Caleb didn't take the money for himself. Instead, he donated most of it to a charity that helped foster children, something his mother had once dreamed of doing. The rest he put into a trust for his future. It wasn't about wealth or status. It was about ensuring that he could move forward without carrying the burden of guilt or expectation. Liam and the others, they were still there, still trying to tear others down to lift themselves up. But Caleb no longer cared about them. He knew that the world wasn't changed by mocking others. It was changed by kindness, by second chances, and by the quiet acts of bravery that people like him performed when no one was watching. Caleb found a group of friends who accepted him for who he was. Sadie, the quiet girl who had stood up for him, was one of them, and though she never asked for anything in return, he found himself sitting with her often, sharing lunch, reading books together, and laughing. But it wasn't just about them. Caleb knew that the real change had to start within him. The forgiveness he had found for Evelyn wasn't something he could give to everyone, but it was a gift, one that allowed him to move forward, to rebuild. He still had moments of doubt. Everyone does. But he learned that healing doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small, quiet steps, like forgiving someone who doesn't deserve it, like speaking out when you're afraid, like standing up for the people who need it most, even if it means standing alone. Years later, Caleb graduated from high school. It was a bittersweet moment. His mother wasn't there to watch him walk across the stage, and Evelyn never lived to see the man he would become. But he felt her presence in every step. He stood at the podium to give his graduation speech. He had prepared a few words, nothing fancy, just the truth. I used to think life was about winning, about being the best, but I've learned that it's not. It's about showing up, it's about trying, and it's about the people who help you get through the toughest times, the ones who believe in you, even when you don't believe in yourself. There was a silence in the room, a quiet weight to his words, and then a ripple of applause. And as Caleb stood there, smiling with his diploma in hand, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. He had come full circle. Not because everything was perfect, but because for the first time, he understood that perfection wasn't the goal. It was simply about being willing to try again, every day. The story of the rich teens and the elderly couple in the diner had changed Caleb's life. But the story didn't end there. It was only the beginning. And as he looked out over the crowd, he knew that the greatest lessons weren't the ones he'd learned from others. They were the ones he'd taught himself along the way. Stories of hope is where journeys like Caleb's are shared, where life's toughest struggles are turned into the strongest triumphs. If this story has touched you or inspired you in some way, we ask you to subscribe and join us for more real-life transformations. Because no matter where you are in life, there's always hope, and the next chapter could be yours.